95 miles northeast of Atlanta, in a small Georgia town most people have never heard of, sits a locomotive that shouldn't exist anymore. It is a Chicago and Northwestern GP9, built in May 1957 for the Rock Island Railroad. More than 60 years old, it is still wearing faded yellow and green paint from a railroad that disappeared in 1995 when Union Pacific absorbed it. And it still runs, not in a museum, not as a tourist attraction. This locomotive pulls freight cars full of grain and lumber through the backyards of rural Georgia, every week, several times a week. Welcome to the Hartwell Railroad. This is one of the last places in America where locomotives from dead railroads still do real work. Conrail blue, Rio Grande orange, Richmond Fredericksburg, and Potomac maroon. Paint schemes from companies that do not exist anymore, still hauling tonnage in the 21st century. The Hartwell operates 58 miles of track across northeast Georgia. The Hartwell line was laid down in 1878 and 1879 as a 3-foot gauge route from Hartwell to Bowersville, back when many southern branch lines were built narrow instead of standard gauge. Decades later, the Toccoa-to-Elberton line joined the system under Hartwell's operation, extending the railroad to its current 58 miles. Southern Railway took control in 1902. It converted everything to standard gauge by 1905. The railroad was sold to local businessmen in 1924. For 66 years, the line stayed in local hands. It was a small-town railroad. 1 or 2 locomotives were enough to keep freight moving between feed mills and lumber yards. Then in 1990, a man named Bennie Ray Anderson bought it. Anderson already owned the Great Walton Railroad, another Georgia short line. He saw potential in Hartwell. In 1995, he picked up the Toccoa-to-Elberton line from Norfolk Southern. Suddenly, Hartwell Railroad had real mileage, real customers, real tonnage to move. Anderson needed locomotives, but new ones cost millions. So he did what every smart short line operator does. He bought old ones, cheap ones. Locomotives the big railroads were scrapping or selling off for pennies on the dollar. That is how a Rock Island-built GP9 ended up in Georgia. That is how a Penn Central GP38 built in 1971 as number 7874 ended up on a short line 500 miles south of Philadelphia. That's how Rio Grande orange and Conrail blue ended up pulling freight through towns like Livonia and Royston. The locomotives Hartwell operates aren't just old, they're survivors. Take that GP9, built in 1957, first-generation diesel, EMD 567C prime mover, 16 cylinders, 1,750 horsepower. It was designed to replace steam locomotives on branch lines and switching duties. Rock Island ran it for years. After Rock Island's bankruptcy in 1980, Chicago and Northwestern acquired the unit. When Union Pacific bought Chicago and Northwestern in 1995, it ended up surplus. Hartwell bought it, renumbered it to 4556, never repainted it. Decades later, that same locomotive is still moving cars, or the Conrail GP38, number 1973 on Hartwell's roster. Built as Penn Central 7874 in 1971, 2,000 horsepower, EMD 645 engine. Penn Central went bankrupt in 1970 but kept ordering locomotives because the government was financing them. When Conrail formed in 1976, it inherited nearly 500 GP38s from Penn Central alone. Conrail renumbered 7874 to 1973, slapped blue paint over the black, ran it for 23 years. When CSX and Norfolk Southern split Conrail in 1999, they did not want every locomotive. Older units got sold off, leased out, sent to short lines. 1973 ended up in Georgia, still in Conrail blue, still unrebuilt, still working. These locomotives operate on track that is rough, not Class 1 main line, not 60 miles per hour welded rail. This is track that rocks and rolls, track that passes through people's front yards, track where trees have grown up so close you can reach out and touch them from the cab. The locomotives handle it because they were built when reliability mattered more than horsepower, when locomotives were designed to run for 30 years, not 15. Hartwell's fleet includes a former Elgin Joliet and Eastern SD-38, built in January 1970, 55 years old. Orange paint from a railroad that operated around Chicago and Gary, Indiana. A railroad most people outside the Midwest have never heard of. There's a Rio Grande GP35 from 1965. Wearing the iconic orange and black that dominated it, it ran Colorado's mountain grades for decades. Rio Grande merged with Southern Pacific in 1988. Southern Pacific merged with Union Pacific in 1996. But that GP35 never got repainted. It just kept moving south, until it ended up in Georgia, still wearing colors from a railroad that died 28 years ago. There is even a General Electric 125-ton switcher built in 1964. An oddity. General Electric did not sell many of these, but Hartwell operates one, sitting in Bowersville, wearing Georgia Power Plant branch paint. 60 years old, still functional. The work these locomotives do is not glamorous. They switch cars at feed mills. They pull hoppers of grain. They deliver lumber to small manufacturers. Sometimes the crew spends an entire day moving storage cars off a branch line just to deliver one single hopper to a customer. But it's real work. Revenue work. The kind of work that keeps small towns connected to the national rail network. And it's work that modern locomotives can't always do, because modern locomotives are heavy, 6 axles, 4,000 horsepower, and over 400,000 pounds. Hartwell's track can't handle that weight in some places, so they use lighter 4-axle units, GP9s, GP38s, and GP35s, locomotives that weigh 245,000 to 260,000 pounds, locomotives that can operate on track that hasn't been rebuilt in decades. Bennie Ray Anderson passed away in September 2022. He was 87 years old. He had owned Hartwell Railroad for 32 years. He had built it from a 10-mile branch line into a 58-mile operation with interchange connections to Norfolk Southern and CSX. The railroad still operates today under the same name, running the same routes, using the same vintage locomotives Anderson assembled over 3 decades. These locomotives represent something most people do not think about. When a railroad dies, its equipment does not just vanish. It gets sold, scrapped, rebuilt, sent to other railroads. Sometimes it ends up on short lines in places nobody expects. That's how Midwestern locomotives end up in Georgia. That's how Northeastern paint schemes end up pulling freight in the South. That's how a 67-year-old GP9 keeps running, long after the railroad that ordered it went bankrupt 50 years ago. The paint is faded now. The bodies are weathered. Some units sit idle, scavenged for parts to keep others running. But the ones that work keep working. Because on a short line like Hartwell, reliability matters more than appearance. Function matters more than paint. And a 50-year-old locomotive that still runs is worth more than a brand new one that can't operate on your track. These aren't museum pieces. They're working locomotives, pulling tonnage, earning revenue, keeping freight moving through small Georgia towns. And as long as the Hartwell Railroad keeps operating, these vintage locomotives will keep rolling.